Welcome to another edition of A Voice to the Gentile Church. I'm Jim Wingerter, and next to me is Pastor Roger Diaz, and Dolores, who's usually with us, had a work conflict today and is not able to be with us. So we're looking at some current events as they relate to the kingdom of God, specifically then with regard to Israel. And so there's been debate in the House of Representatives of the United States of America concerning the Iron Dome. I honestly wasn't aware of the fact that we were financially supporting that to begin with, but clearly we have been. And so there's a small number of people that are vocal, that are stating that they want the U.S. to not be supporting Israel in that fashion anymore, I guess, is the issue.
Yeah, I think the device or the mechanism is Israeli, made by Israel, but the supply of the munition is where Israel depends on this country for help to supply the system. The system is in place. It's an Israeli design, but they need financial help for the munitions. I believe it's what it is.
I guess for the sake of the listeners, in the past, the Gaza inhabitants were firing missiles over into Israel, and they'd fire one and it would get intercepted, and they'd fire one and it'd get intercepted, and it didn't take them long to figure out, hey, maybe if we fire 5 or 10 or 20, one of them will get through. So they've been under tremendous assault.
In the past 10 years, there have been, I think, 3 or 4 campaigns when the Israelis had to defend themselves from the Arabs, Palestinians, who were just lobbing missiles into Israel,
right,
like wildfire. Yeah, and the dome is about 4 or 5 years old, I think, maybe 4 years old. The dome is definitely helpful, but Israel was fending off these missiles pretty well before.
Right.
Before, Israel had no choice but to go in and be more active in taking out the
ground troops, right?
Taking out the points of origin of the missiles. But I think the dome is really, by and large, to appease the nations, to illustrate again how careful Israel is about not being too heavy-handed on the Palestinians.
So the quote Palestinians that live in Gaza are in general quite poor. So
yeah.
they're not funding this out of their own pocket. So
yeah,
there has to be a chain on the other end.
The missiles that's coming in, I think they've recognized the nexus of the points of origin, and it's Turkey via Iran or something. Nevertheless, there will be no end of supplies coming into the Palestinian territory of missiles for Israel. So the dome is useful. It's incredibly protective, but it gives the impression that Israel isn't interested in just sort of taking care of the root problem.
Right.
You know, we just stop the missiles from coming in. We protect our people, and that's usually where it ends. Israel is still trying to not annoy the nations by being heavy-handed on the Palestinians, when ultimately the solution is to put an end to the constant threat of attacks from the so-called Palestinians. That's the solution.
Right, right.
A dome is good, but if you're going to use the dome just to keep people happy with you, then that's not so good.
Right.
You need to take care of the root problem. But it's amazing, and we knew it would happen, that there are elements in Congress that would be so anti-Israel, so anti-Semitic, anti-Israel, that they would move to stop Israel from being funded. So we knew it was going to come, and we know who those elements are, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. They're the same elements that are vocal on lots of other issues as well.
So this lady, AOC.
Yes.
Ms. Cortez
seemed to be the premier voice in the pile.
Dolores has had some things to say about Ocasio-Cortez before.
Yes.
Yeah, we knew from the very beginning that she would be a tremendous liberal plug, just a progressive plug in the midst of the Congress, and that's why she's there. So they're doing very progressive things, very leftist and liberal things, but it's also highly socialistic,
Right.
borderline communistic activity that they're engaged in.
It's such an oxymoron because the left has declared itself to be pro-Israel, and there's a lot of Israelis that are very staunchly left.
Yeah.
So for them to be anti-Israel is kind of anti what their position has been for the last 50 years.
Yeah, there is no doubt an upheaval in the Democratic Party right now because you have this progressive movement that's horribly anti-Semitic, which I don't think has ever existed in the American Congress.
Right.
Which has been a great boost for American Jewry because American Jewry is 80%
Or more.
Democratic,
Right, yes.
liberal. Now they're seeing aspects of liberalism that's anti-Israel. Of course, they couldn't be in support of it. You know.
Right.
So it's interesting to see that. But the Iron Dome is essential, it's good. But it's sort of a Band-Aid on the real issue, which is that Israel has to take care of the problem with the Palestinians.
Right.
What that solution is, we can speculate about that. But if the Palestinians are continuously surrendering to hostility, then ultimately the solution is going to be hostility.
Right.
Or hostile. You can only protect yourself from missiles so much. Ultimately, you'll have to take a drastic action.
Biblically, Israel always had to defeat resoundingly the gods of the other nations.
And trust solely upon God.
Right.
The whole, when you're studying the prophets, during the time of the judges and during the time of the kings in particular, when most of the prophets ministered, you see there a perspective from God that says that if you depend upon the nations, you will omit my involvement. And it's consistent throughout the prophets.
Right.
And during the time of the kings. So I think that's still the case today. I think God is still hoping or pointing in the direction for Israel to trust him only. And don't depend upon alliances, because an alliance with this country or any country amounts to a disalliance with God. Now that might sound a bit harsh or, a bit, however you might want to determine what I just said is. But I think it's absolutely true. If it's biblical, then we can stand on it. God does not want Israel to put its dependency on any other agent but he himself.
So awkward as it can be that the current government, the new government in Israel, is capitulating left and right to American will.
It seems like when Naftali Bennett got into office, that was priority one. Do whatever he could.
That's not what he got elected on.
No,
right.
do whatever. It seemed like it was do whatever he could to make America happy with Israel again. I don't know if that was a personal political move on his part or just something that Israel needed to do. I don't know why they did it, but again, if you look back at the 6-Day War and the War of Independence and all of the skirmishes in between, you see that Israel didn't have a big brother to lean on during those times, and that they literally had no choice but to trust God. And what happened? Resounding victories on the part of Israel.
Right.
Complete humiliation on the part of the powerful enemies that rose against Israel. Right following the 6-Day War, we have the War of Attrition and the War of Yom Kippur, right? And in those two cases, Israel depended on the United States of America for help. And those wars went terrible. I mean, on behalf of Israel.
No, they almost lost their shirt.
Absolutely. And I remember Henry Kissinger during the time of Richard Nixon, that administration,
right.
that it was Kissinger who determined that Israel must depend on the United States for help.
Kissinger,
what a crafty move, huh?
He must have demonic assistance, because Nixon went down hard and Kissinger is still around.
Absolutely. Well, Kissinger, at that time, there were all sorts of powerful globalist organizations that were being formed. The Trilateral Commission,
right
during
the
the
CFR,
time, right during the time that we're talking about in the early 70s, CFR actually formed back at the turn of the last century.
Oh.
But Council on Foreign Relations came into existence in 1973. Kissinger was a big player in that whole formation thing. And he said, he said to Nixon, Mr. President, Israel must depend on the United States for help in the future. And lo and behold, it happens. And the Yom Kippur War, the War of Attrition were terrible showings on the part of Israel. They didn't fare well. And I am convinced that there's a spiritual root to it. And that root, of course, is that Israel is to depend only on God.
Right. Kissinger is the Balaam of our time.
And a Haman and a Balaam.
Yeah.
No question. We see there Israel's failure to depend solely and wholly upon God. I mean, we've encountered many Israelis, dignitaries, who would do everything to convince you that Israel needs the United States of America.
Yes.
And that statement in and of itself sort of omits God. You can't serve God and man. You either serve God or you serve man.
Putting trust in the U.S. is not putting trust in God.
No, and it's an unfortunate thing to see Israel in this place today. The situation in Israel is bleaker, I think, than I've ever seen it. I mean, frankly. I don't think I've ever seen the situation in Israel as bleak as it is right now. Apart from the geopolitical aspects of where Israel is today, we're seeing COVID continuing to plague their society. It's not going away. They're still dealing with the Delta variant.
Right.
And the variant is not yielding to the vaccinated population at all. So we're seeing people who are vaccinated, and even with boosters and third vaccinations and so on, that the variants are not succumbing to the vaccinations, and that's a horrible thing for Israel. Israel, we were in Israel when the COVID thing exploded. And, right at that time, Israel took very quick action to acquiesce to the World Health Organization.
Right.
They were right on board with everything that was being mandated. And they're still there today. And now they're dealing with more vaccinations, insisting upon every person in the Israeli population be vaccinated. And the vaccines are not really helping. There's no evidence anyway that the vaccines are helping, especially when vaccinated people are getting sick. So Israel's in a predicament. We can only sit here and pray and hope that there isn't another powerful variant on the horizon. And if there is, it's going to affect Israel horribly. Israel's economy hinges on Christians, pilgrims, Christian pilgrimages coming into Israel. It is a large part of their economy. Well, many Christians around the world are not wanting to be vaccinated 3 and 4 times.
Once
is kind of pushing it with Christians. So the future for Israel in terms of, their old normal seems to be very elusive at this point, right? I don't think I've ever seen Israel in a place where they're literally in the type of trouble that they're in right now. Their future is bleak from the standpoint of this natural. And then they're dealing also with a government that has completely acquiesced to geopolitics. I mean, that's really what it comes down to with Bennett. He has thrown his hat in the ring, and he's going right along. We have friends in Israel, Ari and Jeremy, Rabbi Ari and Jeremy. They have a community in the region of Amos. Male Amos is the name of the region. And they have a farm, Gan Aragut, that's being threatened right now by global politics. That's what it comes down to, right? We have the Trump deal a year ago that really wasn't a deal at all for Israel. And there were some good aspects of it. One side of it. The other side of it meant that Area C and certain parts of the occupied territory had to be given over to the so-called Palestinians. And now we're seeing the direct effects of that. It's horrible to see this. I don't know. I don't think I've ever seen Israel in such a place. What do you think?
Well, thank God for that the Israeli government was willing to recognize the Shemitah, the year of the Sabbath year. Every
Right.
7 years is
The
the Sabbath year.
agricultural Shabbat.
So they
yeah.
can't rip up the trees, and it's the government. They could do what they wanted to do. So, but they're not. They're recognizing and honoring the Shemitah. I think it is.
So our friends, Rabbi Jeremy Gimpel and Ari Abramovich and their families and other Israelis as well, stationed on that hilltop. They're building this farm, and it's actually a teaching ministry. There's a synagogue, a yeshiva that they're working on, and so on. And of course, its foundation is ministry, and they also have a farm. So the farm is a way by which they can hold the area and build lives for themselves as well. It's not just the farm is not just a mechanism. The farm is ultimately going to be a means of provision, right, as well. So it's a community that they're building.
Sure.
It's a community of faith.
Sure.
And because of aspects of the Trump deal, they're being forced, like you said, to have trees uprooted.
Right.
And like you said just now, what saved them, literally saved them, is the Shabbat, the Sabbath, the agricultural Sabbath, which has put the Israeli government in a place where they cannot or should not rip up the trees during this year.
Right.
So it happened just at the right time.
And then the even more interesting twist of if they have sheep on the land, that they won't depossess them from the land, because that's a big deal, I guess, in Israel to have. They couldn't care less here in Orlando, but
no, it's a big deal in Israel. I think it goes back to the nomadic tribes, who are largely farmers and not just farmers but shepherds.
The Bedouins.
And they have their flock and so on. So it's an interesting predicament that our friends are in. But it seems like if they had more sheep and they became more so shepherds, they might be able to hold on to the mountaintop more readily than if they were not shepherds. So we'll see how it works out a year from now. We'll be praying for sure.
Yeah. Jeremy was confessing this morning that God had turned an evil into a good again.
Amen.
Amen.
That's so obvious, right? So saved by the Sabbath.
Right.
Saved by the Sabbath. So I told Jeremy that would preach, for sure. Yeah, and you know, it's still painful to see Israel in such a place where geopolitics are really knuckling down on them. So much so that someone like Naftali Bennett is readily succumbing to the pressure, and to add injury to the whole thing, injury to shame. He comes here and President Biden falls asleep on him as he's speaking. Literally, I mean, you saw the video, right? Literally fell asleep on him.
I think Biden might have fallen asleep on anybody.
Well, yeah, but it's just shameful to see such a thing happen in Israel in such a place.
Terribly disrespectful at
I
best.
think someone like Bibi Netanyahu or a real strong leader would have said, "Wake up, Mr. I know I would have. I would have for sure. Anyway, so Israel.
Don't let me interrupt your dreams. Yeah.
Israel's in a difficult place. Doesn't change the reality of who Israel is. You know, the gifts and callings of God are irrevocable.
Right.
So regardless of what we see,
and that's true on every level.
Yeah. Regardless of what we see, the people of Israel are God's chosen people. He drove them out of the land in 3 phases. 722 BC, 586 BC, and then 70 AD. This is in keeping with God's promises concerning judgment for Israel or against Israel. Now he's bringing them back, just as he said he would. I don't think God is beholden to the nations. I don't think he's going to allow the nations to interfere with his plan to restore Israel, to glorify Zion, and to lift up his name in the earth through Israel. He said he would do it, so he's doing it.
Right.
This is a setback. It's a hurdle, for sure.
Right.
It's a stone on this pathway that we're on.
Okay. Well, we have a question. We actually have kind of two. So one at a time, right? If the bride of Christ the New Jerusalem, is reigning with Jesus during the Millennial Kingdom, why does she come out of heaven from God at the end of the Millennial Kingdom? It seems like she, or the Naos, is in two places at one time, as the Naos, meaning temple, spiritual temple, is mentioned multiple times being in heaven throughout the book of Revelation.
This was actually from the last program we did, a follow-up to the question. Actually, there were two questions in the one question, so I lay this one aside for now or for another time. So this is the time.
Yes.
All right, so the answer to the question really has to do with the reality that the church will in fact resurrect at the coming of Messiah Jesus, become a priesthood, a royal priesthood, and will reign in the earth. Physically, we'll be here. The Naos will be located in Jerusalem, the living temple. Here and now, the Naos, as it relates to the church, is on the earth, right? That's physically where we are in this time reference that we exist in. But we're not the Naos that we will be on the day of the coming of Christ when we're assembled in Jerusalem. So let's just establish a couple of pointers here before we move on to the next question.
Sure.
So we see in Revelation chapter 5, 9, and 10 that the church will in fact be a kingdom and priests and will reign upon the earth, right? So maybe we can read that reference.
And they sang a new song, saying, Worthy art thou to take the book and to break its seals, for thou wast slain, uses the Old English here in reference to God, and didst purchase for God with thy blood men from every tribe and tongue and people and nation. And thou hast made them to be a king and priests to our God, and they will reign upon the earth.
So upon the earth. Now Revelation chapter 20, verse 6 gives us another pointer as to this priesthood. So it's a royal priesthood, right? A kingdom and priests. So when you think of a royal priesthood, the first thing that should come to mind is Melchizedek.
Right.
The holy order of Melchizedek. And the writer of the book of Hebrews tell us that Jesus is that high priest according to that order. So God is establishing in Jerusalem a high priest, a literal high priest who will reign from Jerusalem as a king and a high priest. Now that was foreshadowed with Melchizedek, who met Abraham on the way back from his conquest of the Mesopotamian kings. What happened? Well, he came out from Salem, which is Jerusalem, and he met with Abraham. So there's a bit of a foreshadowing there of the positioning of the high king and priest, the high priest and king, and his position in Salem or Jerusalem, the place where he is appointed to be. Now, King David also became a foreshadowing of the Melchizedek kingship priesthood when he put on the high priest garment, the tefillin, and not the tefillin, the Turim and the, what's it called, the Thurim and the Furim, whatever that is. Anyway, the ephod, when he had the high priest ephod, he dressed himself as a high priest. And
Urim and Thurim.
He dressed himself as the high priest, and he ministered as a high priest. But he wasn't a Kohanim. He wasn't of the sons of Aaron.
Right.
But he was a king.
Right.
So you have this picture with King David reigning from where? Jerusalem, physically in Jerusalem as a high priest and a king. Foreshadowing what we're seeing here when King Jesus, King Yeshua, reigns in Jerusalem. So this priesthood will reign in the earth. It's a royal priesthood. But this point that we're going to see here in Revelation chapter 20, verse 6 is important. It tells us how long this priesthood will reign in the earth for. So read that if you would.
Blessed and holy is the one who has a part in the first resurrection. Over these the second death has no power, but they will be priests of God and of Messiah, and will reign with him for 1,000 years.
So they're reigning with Melchizedek, the high priest and king, for 1,000 years in the earth. Now, this priesthood, this church, this ecclesia, this Knesset, is the Naos, right? Paul identifies the church as the Naos. In a few cases, in 2 Thessalonians, in Ephesians, the church is the Naos. But here and now, very limited, but in the age to come, very bold and manifest. The church would be the living temple, the Naos. Now, let's look at the sequence of events that will lead to the great white throne judgment now. So in the same chapter 20, if you can read 7 to 10.
And when the 1,000 years are completed, Satan will be released from his prison and will come out to deceive the nations which are in the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, or Magog, to gather them together for the war. The number of them is like the sand of the seashore. And they came up on the broad plain of the earth and surrounded the camp of the saints and the beloved city, and fire came down from heaven and devoured them. And the devil who deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and brimstone, where the beast and the false prophet are also. And they will be tormented day and night forever and ever.
So this movement, this rebellious movement, it's sort of like Amalek all of a sudden. Suddenly, really literally suddenly, Amalek is upon the scene for the last time. And I mean for the last time. We're not going to see Amalek after this. What is Amalek's initiative? To destroy the saints, who we would say we might be at that time, also Israel, and the beloved city, which is Jerusalem. So we can assume that as Amalek, Gog and Magog, begins to quickly assemble against God's people and against us, we are here physically located on the earth still.
Right.
Now, this is a critical point. At some given point, God determines to destroy this creation.
Right.
As Peter said, to burn the elements, to just bring this to a complete end. This is what Isaiah saw in Isaiah 65 and somewhat in 66, where he says, where Isaiah said that, behold, God is going to make a new thing. All things are done away with. So that doing away of the old things has to do with this fire that comes down and consumes this creation. So naturally, we, the church, will not be a part of that consumption. Who's going to be consumed in that fire? Well, of course, the nations. Everything apart from Messiah, Jesus, and the church. So what happens? Naturally, we're not here, so we're where?
Well, being with him is like is heaven.
So just prior, we would conclude, just prior to the destruction of this creation, we are with God in the heavenlies, and the next thing we see is that we're coming with him. So there is no prospect of us being in two places at one time.
Right.
We're here for the millennial period. At the end of the millennial period, destruction is determined by fire. Everything's going to be made new. So at that point, we're taken up before God. There's a literal temple that's being built, right? The New Jerusalem, which is massive, 1,500 miles cubed.
Huge, right.
So we can only say that during the Millennial Kingdom, we have this situation where Jesus is in the earth. That New Jerusalem is already prepared. When the judgment is set, that the nations will be destroyed, Gog and Magog, we are taken to that New Jerusalem, and the next thing that John sees is that we're coming down to earth. Now, we're talking about space and time, exigent space and time. We're talking about space and time phenomenon. So when we talk about space and time, it's something that we fallen humans are not fully equipped to understand completely. Some of us have more brain cells than others, or just more time on their hands than others, and more desire, and they learn more about like Einstein and others who dealt with special relativity and all of the string theory people and so on that deals with dimensions and space and time. So, but we know this. We, being eternal beings, even during the Millennial Kingdom, we are not constricted or restricted by space and time. We are living in the eternal form. Space and time is not a factor for us. When you consider Jesus in the new creation form, he appeared and disappeared. He folded space and time. In other words, he just popped out of this physical creation And so we have to understand that we will have that creation as well. So at the end of the millennial kingdom, when the saints are surrounded by man, it would be easy for us just to be in the New Jerusalem. By even a thought, we're there. Of course, we have the great king with us. But space and time is something we have to consider, because we don't know, actually, and this is the point, we don't know if following our departure from this old creation and the point of return into the new creation, if 1,000,000 of our years go by, we may spend an eternity in what we call heaven before we return.
Yeah.
But from the standpoint of what John saw, everything was sequential in order, seemingly happening in a tight sequential order.
Right.
You know, millennial kingdom, Satan is thrown into the lake of fire, the abyss, the beast, the false prophet, thrown into the lake of fire. The priesthood is in the earth. It seems very sequential. Gog and Magog, rebellion, God destroys this creation, and great white throne. So it seems to be a very trackable order of sequence. But we don't know if that's the case at all. We don't know if while this is happening in this time confinement, other things are happening in heaven that transcends anything that's happening here. And what is heaven? Well, heaven is simply a place and time in the future, as it relates to the space-time continuum. So it is something that you can't give a foolproof, complete, ironclad yes or no answer to. But it's suffice to say that the Naos will be on the earth. And when the New Jerusalem descends, the Naos will be there. The New Jerusalem will be the Naos. So there's no chance, according to the question there, of multiple Naoses.
Right. Again,
we're dealing with something that we don't fully understand. We're dealing with something that's outside of space and time and folding together into space and time.
Without getting heady about all this, succession of events doesn't necessarily have a clock attached to it.
No.
Right.
So you're dealing with a sequence of events, an order of occurrences. So it's enough to say that the church is the Naos, the living temple, will exist that way in the earth during the millennial kingdom, and more so, more completely in the new creation. You know, John saw the new creation, right? So he gave us a few verses, just 4 verses, to give us a sense for what's the new creation is all about.
At the end of the day, it's not a lot of information that we're granted.
No.
Pretty much Revelation 21, 22 here are
right.
highly
We would have
expository.
preferred an entire book on the subject.
Sure. Yes. 21, 1-4. And I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth passed away, and there is no longer any sea. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, made ready as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, Behold, the tabernacle of God is among men, and he shall dwell among them, and they shall be his people, and God himself shall be among them. And he shall wipe away every tear from their eyes, and there shall no longer be any death. There shall no longer be any mourning or crying or pain, for the first things have passed away.
So there's a lot that seems to be omitted there, but, you know, like you said at the beginning, before the program, does it really matter? Do we need to have details about how things will actually pan out? I don't think we do. I think what we have in the Bible is enough for us to have some basis of understanding for, and we do. So the living temple, we will reign in the earth for 1,000 years. At the end of that period, we'll reign with God as the New Jerusalem for eternity.
Right.
That's a lot.
Right.
So
it floors me that he goes out of his way to say, and there is no ocean, no sea.
Ocean. That's a different creation.
Yeah.
Different creation. Maybe we go back to the first form of creation we had in the garden, where you had the waters above, the waters below, the Rachia, where, you know, that whole initial creation type setting. We might be going back to that, where water would come up from the earth to water the whole ground. We'll see.
Yeah.
We'll see. We can't say more than we know.
We'll probably stand there and marvel for centuries.
Probably. So I got a text from someone in the congregation. She lives a ways away from the congregation, but she was trying to submit a question onto our website, and she kept getting spammed or questions to determine if she was spam or not, I think was what happened. And so they popped a question just to verify that she wasn't spam, I guess. And the question was, what is the eternal capital of Israel? And she was supposed to answer it correctly, I guess, to override the spam mechanism. And she said Jerusalem, and it came back saying incorrect 2 or 3 times. So, and the final question was, the final thing she said was, I give up. What is the answer it wants? So that's the real essence of the question. What is the answer this anti-spam mechanism actually wanted? If they asked the question, they had a specific answer in mind, and it wasn't Jerusalem.
It may not have been Tel Aviv.
Maybe from that perspective, Israel should not exist.
Right.
I don't know. But I think Tel Aviv would have been the answer that it was looking for.
Okay.
No doubt. Because there is this movement in the earth, very anti-Israel, very anti-Semitic Israel, very anti-Zionist even, that wants to deny Jerusalem to be the capital of Israel, and that Jerusalem was actually never an Israeli or a Jewish possession to begin with. Now that movement is very real, and it's very much connected to the globalists, the United Nations and all of the other global affiliates. So their wish is to separate Jerusalem from the people of Israel. And it's amazing that they're actually doing that on the internet with little crafty little things like this. So I thought, okay, so maybe we can talk about this. So what is it about the nations? Why is it, I should say, the nations are so eager to strip Israel of Jerusalem? What's behind that? What do you think? What would you say?
Well, they're always pushing for no relationship or no identity with the Jewish people with the land of Israel, but there's all these archaeological sites over there that are unearthing almost daily evidences that Israel was clearly in the possession of the Israelis.
The archaeological evidence is monumental. You have more than enough, more than ample evidence that Jerusalem has been, at least since the time of King David, has been the possession of a sovereign Jewish state. Jerusalem became the sovereign capital of Israel during the time of King David. When King David took the Zion, he left Hebron for the express purpose to become king in Jerusalem over all of Israel, right?
Right.
That's what we see in the Chronicles. And so David determined that Jerusalem would be the capital of Israel. So the people of Israel exist today, despite the 2,000 years of diaspora, the destruction of the temple twice. They exist today, and therefore the capital of their of who they are, of them as a nation, should be Jerusalem. If we take the Bible as credible historic data, if we do. Now the UN is determined to, despite all of the historical, biblical, and archaeological evidence, to deem that Jerusalem is a universal city, does not belong to Israel. So, question, historically speaking, when did Jerusalem become an international city or a universal city?
Gee, yeah, that's a brain twister because I hadn't considered it.
Yeah, it does connect itself to religion, world religion, right?
Sure.
Because it was the Byzantine, the Roman Catholic
which is
movement,
Catholic, right?
that deemed that Jerusalem should be, in fact, a Christian, a imperial Christian
Right.
center.
So they were adding to the Jewish roots,
Right.
the Christian roots. But then
Of course,
not long after that,
Yeah.
Muhammad comes along and the declaration is made that he ascended into heaven from that mountain, which...
so when you consider Constantine, right, referred to in Christianity
Right.
as Constantine the Great, the savior of Christianity, although there's so much evidence. You know, he has an arch in Rome, the Constantine Arch, right?
Mm-hmm.
And when you consider the arch that reflects his victories, there's not one symbol or icon on that arch, and there are many, that points to his Christianity. Every bit of what we see on that arch, and you can go there today and see it, points to paganism.
It's-
the deepest form
yeah.
of paganism.
It's a
actually.
huge rationalization for the Catholic Church to say that he became a believer.
It's a hopeless endeavor, I think,
Right.
to ever prove that he was anything but a pagan.
Right.
And he saw himself as a pagan god.
As a god.
There's evidence that he saw
He
himself.
minted a coin with his likeness next to the likeness of Apollo.
No doubt. He actually, and I've been researching this recently, he actually saw himself as Apollo, but a greater manifestation of Apollo.
Right.
He did. He did. He saw himself.
Not too
that way.
arrogant, right?
Not too arrogant. So the arch that exists in Rome in ancient times had its main opening. At the back of the main opening, when you approach Rome, a statue of Apollo, or a bronze likeness of Apollo. But right behind the main arch, and on top of the main arch, you had Constantine on a chariot made in bronze. Huge thing. And so when you approach this arch, you would see Apollo, and you would see above Apollo Constantine. And it's done that way for that reason, illustrating that Constantine is Apollo, a manifestation of Apollo, but greater than Apollo. He's the physical manifestation of Apollo. So this is Constantine. Now he is purported to be the founder of the savior of Christianity.
Right.
Not the founder of Christianity. They haven't gone that far. But I think the Christianity that he has been the savior of is a different Christianity.
Right.
A variant Christianity for sure. Now, it was during his time as an emperor that he sent his own mom into exile. His mom was apparently a genuine Christian, from what we can tell. Her name was Helena, right?
Yes.
Queen Helena. She was a genuine Christian. She had genuine concerns about Christianity, the history. She was looking for understanding and archaeological evidence. And suddenly she gets kicked out of Rome.
Right.
And she ends up in, quote unquote, the Holy Land. She begins her campaign in the Galilee area. She goes and she determines important sites. And she goes to Jerusalem, and it's decreed that Jerusalem should be the possession of the Roman Empire at that point, even before then, because Rome had controlled Jerusalem. Ever since the expulsion in 70 AD, and even with the Bar Kokhba revolt that came 175 years later or something, Jerusalem has always been the possession and the concern of the Roman Empire. Now the Roman Empire became the Holy Roman Empire, to be followed by the Byzantine. Now, why the Byzantine? Because the Byzantine is the Eastern Roman Empire, which is where Constantine moved his Constantinople
Right.
is the capital of the Byzantine Empire. So you see there a reality that this Holy Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, began to recognize Jerusalem as its own possession. Imperial global religion recognizing Jerusalem as its own possession. Of course, not too long after that period, you have the Muslims who comes along, and they're fighting over Jerusalem, and that fight has been going on since then. So the reality of Jerusalem being anything but Jewish or Israeli goes all the way back to 70 AD.
Right.
So the root of what we're seeing today actually goes back to 70 AD, right? this movement that wants to deny anything Israeli or Jewish about Jerusalem goes back to that great conflict. And I think ultimately they're trying to establish this reality for themselves, that since the conquest of Jerusalem, since Jerusalem was destroyed and the Jews were defeated, all history should be erased. There should be no historiosity concerning the Jewish people and Jerusalem ever again, because the Roman Catholic Institute possessed it. And to a certain extent, today still possess it. Of course, the Muslims and the Hindus, the Muslims and the Christians squabbled over Jerusalem back and forth, the so-called Crusades, until Suleiman, the Ottoman Sultan, decreed that Jerusalem is a Muslim possession, but that Jews can return to it. So it was the possession of the Ottoman Empire for 400 years. Right?
That saved Israel from Catholicism.
Right. So that's a whole different angle on the narrative, right? But the point is, at no point were there any initiative to recognize Jerusalem as anything but Gentile.
Right.
Now,
I think the people that are still living there, the Greek Orthodox priests that are there and the Roman priests that are there,
right,
still maintain that attitude.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
They're very orthodox, and they're pointing back to the Constantinople period when
right,
Constantine decreed Christianity to be the global religion. Quite directly, if you speak to any Orthodox person, a Roman Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, even Egyptian Orthodox, they all point back to that time when the Romans established a global religion. And that's where they get their authority from. I think, honestly, because a different religion was established then than biblical Christianity.
Yeah.
All right. So
maybe Constantine's mother meant well, but I saw a docu on this, and she declared the location of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre to be the place where Jesus resurrected from. But what was there when she went there was a temple to Sol Invictus.
I saw that. I did, in fact, hear about that. And so I'm not going to judge Queen Helena. Seems like she was a believer.
Right.
She had power. She had authority to make decisions on behalf of Christianity that has provided the history of Christianity.
She fared better than his son and his wife because he had them executed.
Right. So I would have preferred not to consider her findings, actually, because she was not an authority on
and yet
ancient
all the
Israel.
locations that are over there are locations that she said this happened here.
And where did she get her information from? From Bedouins and from...
and there might be some.
Might be some.
They might have wanted Roman coins.
Regardless. So, or favor from the queen.
Right, right.
So at any rate, there is absolutely tremendous archaeological, historic, biblical evidence that says that Israel, that Jerusalem is in fact and always has been the capital of Israel. But today you have this movement that is so determined, so zealous to exclude Israel, that they would look at literal evidence, create their own historiographies, and just exclude Israel altogether. The evidence is right before them. I mean, how many incredibly powerful artifacts have been discovered in and around Jerusalem that points to Israel.
Too many to count.
A preponderance.
Yeah.
You can't even begin to fathom how much. But so it goes back to the idea that after 70 AD, Jerusalem is cannot be the possession of the Jewish people ever again. And that's because the Romans fought so hard to expel them, to keep them expelled. They fought with the Muslims and back and forth. Now, so today, right now as we speak, we know about what's happening in Dubai, right? So
right, yes.
Maybe you can talk a little bit about what's happening in Dubai. Dubai is one of the capital cities of the Arab Emirates.
It's Abu Dhabi, I think.
Abu Dhabi, okay.
Yeah.
So, about 4 years ago, or maybe 5 years ago, I became aware of a movement of leading religions that's been putting their emphasis on Dubai, that particular city. Or the government of Saudi Arabia has been considering Dubai to be sort of the capital of a world religion. And that's been happening for quite a while. In fact, Trump went there and met with the Arab Muslim leaders. And if you remember what happened, it was a big event. And it was just sort of a big moment. Trump showed up, and they were working on this union of religions. So actually, right now, they're building a center. It's called I can't remember the exact name for the center, but it's a place where the three Abrahamic faith can come together. They're building a synagogue, a mosque, and a church in one compound, and they're planning to establish a global religion in Dubai. Of course, all of the other factors will come in: the Hindus, the Buddhists. All of the different religious movements will be a part of that umbrella, but they're focusing on the three Abrahamic faiths, right? So it's incredible that the Muslims and the Christians are all in perfect agreement about Jerusalem. It is not to be Israeli. All right? It is to be sort of a universal city, the city of Abraham. Right. I guess they would say the city of Abraham, the place of Abrahamic faith. And which does not belong to Israel, it belongs to every faith. And that's ultimately where they're going with this, that Jerusalem would become sort of the center of this world religion that they've been working on for quite a while. You know, Dubai is a recent aspect of this world religion. They've been working on this world religion, global ecumenicalism, for over 100 years now. About 120 years, they've been working on pulling this whole thing together.
It remains to be seen that they're able to do anything at all. I mean, the Christians are deliberate at converting everyone to Christianity. The Muslims are anti-conversion to the point that they'll behead people for apostasy from Islam. It's pie in the sky thinking that we can merge these things together without making some radical surgical changes.
Yeah. Well, it's pie in the sky thinking to bring about a global order.
Right.
A one world government, but they're working on it.
Right.
Currently, the French are saying no, we don't want anything to do with this, which is amazing. The Swiss are also saying no, keep your global union, and other countries are saying no to it.
The Swiss that have had virtually no spine with regard to anything for centuries. Mm-hmm.
And what's really amazing is that the Brits, then it's no longer Britain, but England seems to be going right along with it.
Yeah.
Which is amazing. But at any point, the idea of a global religion seems impossible. But is it really impossible? I think not, because the desire to coalesce humanity will be greater than the need to allow the radical factions to exist.
Yeah.
You understand what I'm saying? The radical factions, I think, will be put down. I think the reality of a future global religious union is very possible. It's going to be extremely difficult to keep it and to sell it. They have to sell this to the world. But you see, global ecumenicalism, like I said earlier, really is about 120 years old. This whole dream of bringing about one umbrella of religions that will cover the entire world, all of humanity, is very old. And they've been working diligently, like I said, to bring it into existence. I think what we're seeing in Dubai, sort of the three Abrahamic faiths, is a leap forward. We know here of local rabbis and ministers who went to Dubai several years ago to help frame the prospect of such a thing. And this is happening every year. It's been happening every year for, I think, since 1985. There's been meetings everywhere around the world to help bring this into a place of reality. So I don't think they're going to allow radical Islam or evangelical Christianity or Orthodox
Right.
Judaism to stand in the way of their goals to bring about this final religion.
We're not invited, I'm sure.
Oh, no, we're probably last on the list for sure.
Well, that's how you keep from taking the mark of the beast.
Right. So I think their goal for Jerusalem is to sort of label Jerusalem as a global capital. And therefore, if it's a global capital, a universal capital, it cannot be the capital of Israel. Sorry, Israel, you'll have to choose a different capital. Is the perspective I think that the globalists have. And this is important for the globalists. And that's why when this Trump deal included peace between the Saudi Arabians and Israel, the emphasis continued to be Jerusalem. You know, given the Arabs or the Saudi Arabians more authority on the Temple Mount, that's at the center of the issue concerning Jerusalem. So I think there's this movement. Now, Jesus said in Luke chapter 21 very clearly, and God's word will not fail. He said that Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot of the Gentile until the time of the Gentiles is fulfilled. So we see very vividly that June 6, 1967, Jerusalem becomes, again, for the first time since 70 AD, the possession of a sovereign Jewish state. So regardless of the opinion of the globalists, the wishes of a one-world religion, Jerusalem is, and will continue to be the capital of the Jewish people, of the people of Israel. God determined for that to be the case, and nothing's going to prevent it.
Right.
Right?
I mean, there's a certain element of the reason why they want Jerusalem is because the Lord has chosen Zion for his Zion's another word. Zion's a mountain in Jerusalem.
There's a preponderance of evidence in the Bible. If you take the Bible to be credible in terms of evidence, there's just a tremendous amount of biblical references that clearly illustrates that God has a plan for Zion.
Right.
I mean, it's in the Psalms, it's in the prophets, it goes all the way back to the period of the kings, before the period of the kings. You know, in Deuteronomy, God said to the people of Israel in Deuteronomy 12 to 16, 11 references of a place where he would choose to establish his name. And that place became Jerusalem. So the God of the universe, the God of the Bible, has chosen Jerusalem to be his city, the city of the great king. That has nothing to do with a global union of religions.
Quite the opposite. Right.
In fact, when you follow that through in the book of Revelation, that global government, that religious government beast becomes the false prophet of the book of Revelation. And what happens to the false prophet? We read earlier in Revelation chapter 20 that the false prophet and the beast, the political government and the religious government, will be both thrown into the lake of fire. So their opinion is that valuable in regards to what God is doing. He's not going to allow them to prevent Israel from being the capital of the Jewish state. So I thought it was interesting when I got that text from this congregant saying that spam mechanism wanted her to answer the question. And she said, I gave up. What's the answer it wants? Well, the answer it wants is Jerusalem is not the capital of the Jewish state. It is Tel Aviv. Right? Tel Aviv.
Unless she didn't capitalize the J.
Well, maybe. So the world has its agenda. You know, Psalm 2, when you read Psalm 2, it's very pertinent to where we are today. Why does the heathen rage and the people imagine vanity, a vain thing?
Right.
Right. So what does it say? God has a plan for his anointed, and he laughs at man's plans. You know, man plans and God laughs.
Right.
So I just think it's interesting that so many people in the world are consumed with all of the things that are troubling us right now, while the globalists are marching forward with their plan to establish Jerusalem as a united city, a universal city for all the world's religions. And in the last 5 years, the UN and UNICEF has been working diligently to de-Israelize the Temple Mount, right?
Yeah.
Every artifact found is sort of just brushed away. I remember a few years ago, UNICEF came out with this declaration that there's no evidence at all that Jerusalem was ever a Jewish issue. And then a few weeks later, in the city of David, they found the coin of Hezekiah, King Hezekiah, right there in the dirt. So, you know, God is speaking to the nations, and the issue is that the nations are not really listening. They don't care about God's opinion.
Right.
God's opinion will prevail,
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah.
I think, regardless of what their opinions are. So we're seeing this prospect of a global religion. Think about how first of all deceived they are to believe that God will approve of something like this. Now, from a certain point of view, a liberal Christian point of view, what would be wrong with all religions getting along and just getting along fine? There's no division. That seems to be what God would want, right? But the truth is, this will never happen under man's governance. It's going to happen when God sends his government.
Right.
When Jesus comes and he establishes the kingdom of God in Jerusalem, all of the nations will flow together as one. Would there be a religion at the time? Not necessarily, but there will be the reality of knowing God in the earth, knowing that Yeshua Jesus is the King.
Who was it that said, no one will say know the Lord because everyone will know the Lord?
Jeremiah.
Yeah.
Speaking there of the people of Israel, but I think that's pertinent also to the nations.
Sure.
Those that are left.
Right.
According to Zechariah.
Right.
Those that are left. That the nations will come up to Jerusalem to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacle. If they're coming up to Jerusalem to celebrate tabernacles, they know God.
Right.
Or they know an aspect of God.
Right.
So that's what we're moving towards. And I just thought it was interesting that in the midst of all the confusion we're seeing in the world today, their plan to unite man through a religious order is marching on.
Yeah.
So they talk about, it's funny, they talk about the three Abrahamic faiths, right? The house of Abraham, I think, is what they're going to name the site. What are they going to do about the other religions that they've already included, such as Wiccaism, witchcraft, Satanism, which they've already included into the factor? What are they going to do? Build a temple to Satan in Dubai? It's just amazing.
Because of the compromise, these three houses that they've already selected end up being houses to Satan.
I think these three houses, the synagogue, the church, and the mosque that they're building there, is only a front for all of the other religions that will come under this great umbrella. So how can the Buddhist, the Muslim, and the Satanist walk together? Is that even possible? No, it's not.
How can the Satanist and the Christian walk together?
How can the Satanist?
You can't believe the Bible.
How can the Satanist and anyone walk together?
Right.
But you see, it's all a facade. It is all deception, and it's deception in order to deceive humanity into believing this great hope, which is not a hope at all.
Right.
And so this is where we are. Amazing.
We've watched government just come up with thing after thing after thing, and it never gets better. It always gets worse.
This is man's efforts. Man's efforts would always amount to futility, right? We'll give birth, what does the Bible say? We'll give birth to air, to nothing. And that's the reality. So the hope that we do have is the kingdom of God. And God would send his Messiah to reign in the earth, to establish his kingdom. That kingdom, the headquarters, the capital, if I can say that, of that kingdom is Jerusalem. The throne of God will be placed squarely in the midst of Jerusalem. And from there, he will reign, and the governments of the world will rest upon his shoulder. And that's inevitable, according to the Bible. So as believers, we ought to have a biblical paradigm. Our mindset has to be biblical. So I want to encourage our listeners to be biblical, to embrace the biblical narrative, not the religious or not the pseudo-historic narrative of Christianity or Buddhism or Islam or even Judaism, but embrace the biblical narrative of the reality of a sovereign king reigning in the earth. And it's coming. It's not far off. And when it comes, it will mean joy, it will mean salvation for all the nations. The nations will walk by the light of this kingdom that God is preparing for all humanity.
So on that note, we offer a Bible course here on our campus. If you're in the Orlando area, you're welcome to come and join us. We've only had a handful of classes so far, so it would still be possible for you to jump into the class and get caught up on the work. If you're not in the area, the course is available through our website online. And so until next week,
Shalom.
Shalom.